You're listening to Parasearch Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio. Parasearch Radio, broadcasting to the UK and beyond.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch Radio.
And a very good evening to you all. Yes, it's me again, your history-loving hostess of the haunted, Penny G. Morgan, here on Parasearch Radio, presenting another fact-filled episode of Haunted Histories. Last week, we spoke to Gemma Snow of Fright Nights Cambridge about Kelvedon Hatch, secret nuclear bunker. If you missed the show, fear not, because you can catch it on podcast or just plain old download and listen to it via our Parasearch link on Spreaker, as you can with all of our shows, and not just Haunted Histories either. Any of the shows on Parasearch Radio are available to listen to after the event, so don't worry if 9 o'clock in the evening is either too late, too early, or just not plain convenient for you. We are, on Haunted Histories, likely to revisit some of the places that we've covered so far, so if you have had any experiences in, well, any of them, please let me know via our Parasearch Facebook page and I will mention them on air for you. Names can be changed if so needed. So, what delights do we have for you tonight? Well, in about 20 minutes or so, I'll be joined by the fascinating and very, very eloquent Mr. Richard Estep, author of books such as The World's Most Haunted Hospitals, to talk about his chapter on St Thomas's Hospital in London. But what are we going to look at for the next quarter of an hour? Well, see if these two paragraphs I'm going to read out for you give you an idea. You shall kindly treat the patients under your care, as well as keeping them sweet and clean in their persons, bedding and every other respect, as in giving them their meat and drink in a comfortable manner. You are to wash all the foul rollers, rags, bolsters, etc. that are used in the ward, for which you are monthly to receive from the steward the quantity of soap allotted, and you are to take care that none of the said rollers, bolsters, etc. be wasted or destroyed through your neglect. No? No ideas yet? Okay. What about if I said the lady with the lamp? Hopefully you'll know who I'm talking about then. Well, we're going to be looking a little bit at Florence Nightingale and what she contributed to both nursing and medicine in general. I say in general because I'm good, but even I can't cover it all in the next 15 minutes, but hopefully we're going to look at some of it. Well, Florence was born in 1820 into a rich, upper-class, very well-connected British family at the Villa Colombaia in Florence, Italy, and was actually named after the city of her birth. She had an older sister, Frances Parthenope, who had similarly been named after her place of birth, Parthenope, a Greek settlement now in the city of Naples. The family moved back to England in 1821, with Nightingale being brought up in the family's homes in Hampshire and Derbyshire. Funnily enough, Hampshire is actually meant to be one of the ones she's reported to haunt occasionally. Who knows if that's true? Well, neither Florence or Parthenope went to school. They were educated at home, first by governors, or governesses, and then by their father. Both were excellent students and studied French, Latin, and German, something which probably aided Florence's chosen vocation later on in life. What was obvious when looking at Florence was that although her education was as good as any of the boys of the day, and she was incredibly intelligent, this was the sort of early to mid 1800s, and her primary duties were for obedience and to make a good marriage. As was also quite typical of the time, Florence had a very strong Christian faith and felt that God was calling her. It was his voice, speaking to her, that made her believe a career in nursing was her future. This came just after caring for her family and their servants during a major flu epidemic. Whilst most parents these days would be pleased their child wanted a career such as nursing, back then it was only working class women who nursed for a living, and as such, Florence's parents were both horrified and, to be honest, anxious at her chosen path. She first trained to be a nurse at a religious community called Kaiserwerth near Dusseldorf, where the pastor and his wife ran a hospital, orphanage and a college. She learned about medicine, the dressing of wounds, and also observed amputations amongst many other things. Back in the UK, her mother had finally realised her daughter's passion for nursing was not to abate, and she secured a position at a private care home for gentlewomen in Harley Street, London, in 1853. It was actually the following year, 1854, that a cholera epidemic, another one, broke out in London, and she went to help victims of this at the nearby Middlesex Hospital, also in London. If you remember, when we talked about the ragged schools a few episodes ago and Dr. Bernardo, cholera was one of the things that stopped him leaving to do missionary work in China. Well, Florence was also involved briefly with ragged schools as well, although not the Bernardo School in East London that we did the show on. Anyway, I digress. Back to 1854 again. Well, it was that summer that Britain and France joined their ally Turkey and declared war against Russia. The Crimean War, as it was known, ran for nearly 3 years from 1853 to 1856. And it's probably this and the work she did here that Florence is most well known for, although when you start to look into her you realise she did an awful lot more, albeit not quite as dramatic. Anyway, on the 21st of October 1854, she and the staff of 38 women volunteer nurses that she trained, including her aunt, May Smith, and 15 Catholic nuns who were mobilised by Henry Edward Manning, were sent, under the authorisation of Sidney Herbert, to the Ottoman Empire. Nightingale was assisted in Paris by her friend Mary Clark, and they were deployed about 295 nautical miles, which is around 339 normal miles, across the Black Sea from Balaclava in the Crimea, where the British camp was based. Nightingale arrived early in November 1854 at Selameve Barracks in Scutari, which is actually modern-day Üsküdar in Istanbul. Her team found that poor care for wounded soldiers was being delivered by overworked medical staff in the face of official indifference, basically. Medicines were in short supply, hygiene was being neglected, and mass infections were very, very common, many of them being fatal. And there was also no equipment to process food for patients. After Nightingale herself sent a plea to the Times for a government solution to the poor condition of these facilities, the British government commissioned the absolutely incredible Isambard Kingdom Brunel, very infamous Isambard Kingdom Brunel, to design a prefabricated hospital that could be built in England and shipped to the Dardanelles. The result was Renkioi Hospital, a civilian facility that, under the management of Dr. Edmund Alexander Parkes, had a death rate of less than 1/10 that of Scutari. Stephen Paget, in the Dictionary of National Biography, asserted that Nightingale reduced the death rate from 42% to 2%. Amazing. Either by making improvements in hygiene herself, or by calling for the Sanitary Commission. For example, Nightingale implemented hand washing, something as simple as hand washing, and other hygiene practices in the war hospital in which she worked. During her first winter at Scutari, 4,077 soldiers died there. 10 times more soldiers died from illnesses such as typhus, typhoid, cholera again, and dysentery than from actual battle wounds. With overcrowding, defective sewers and a total lack of ventilation, the Sanitary Commission had to be sent out by the British government to Scutari in March 1855, almost 6 months after Nightingale had arrived. The Commission flushed out the sewers and improved ventilation. Death rates were sharply reduced, but she never ever claimed credit for helping to reduce those death rates. In 2001 and 2008, the BBC actually released documentaries that were critical of Nightingale's performance in the Crimean War, as were some follow-up articles published in The Guardian and the Sunday Times. Nightingale scholar Lynn MacDonald has dismissed these criticisms as often preposterous, arguing that they are not supported by primary sources. Nightingale believed that death rates were due to poor nutrition, lack of supplies, stale air and overworking of the soldiers. This was still a time where people believed that illnesses could be created by miasmas, i.e. bad smells in the air. After she actually returned to Britain at the end, she began collecting evidence before the Royal Commission on the Health of the Army. She came to believe that most of the soldiers at the hospital had been killed by poor living conditions, and this experience influenced her later career. That's when she started to advocate sanitary living conditions as being of great importance. Consequently, she actually reduced peacetime deaths in the army and turned her attention to the sanitary design of hospitals and the introduction of sanitation in working-class homes. The hospitals, though, going back to the Crimea, the hospitals in Scutari where Nightingale were based were not pleasant places to be. Dirty, smelly, unsanitary, normally riddled with vermin. The nurses had to perform hard physical tasks such as washing, sewing and cooking, not just pure nursing duties, and they also worked incredibly long hours. 11 nurses did not return from Scutari. They died from diseases that also decimated the troops and killed several military doctors too. Funnily enough, one of the things the nurses used to complain about the most was the uniforms they had to wear. Nightingale actually imposed that a sash was worn by nurses that she had brought to Scutari rather than just followers on who turned up to help. I mentioned earlier about the unsanitary conditions. Well, these weren't helped by the fact that the old barrack building had actual blocked sewers, and basically they were working on top of a giant cesspool. How delightful. Once the engineer came, Dr. John Sutherland, and unblocked the sewers, performed repairs and supplied clean water, the death rate did begin to fall. But Nightingale isn't the only saviour who should be associated, in my view, with the Crimean War. A Russian army surgeon, Nikolai Pirogov, was revolutionary in using anaesthetics. Most British army doctors were reluctant to use them, things such as chloroform and ether, when performing amputations, but Pirogov used them to great effect. Plus he devised plaster casts for settling bones and developed a triage system for sorting casualties according to who would benefit most from treatment. He also welcomed women as nurses. Quite forward-thinking, really, for someone of that era, as Nightingale faced an awful lot of antagonism from the British Army hierarchy. The other person that people tend to forget about is the amazing, in my view, Mary Seacole. Mary had always faced a lot of prejudice due to the fact that she was African-Caribbean and mixed race, and like her mother, she was a doctress, or what we would probably call now a herbalist. She actually applied to be one of the 38 nurses who accompanied Nightingale originally, but was turned down, so she decided to make her own way to the Crimea, setting up a general store, canteen and unofficial surgery called the British Hotel on the road to front lines. This was advertised to be a place with a mess table and also somewhere that convalescing soldiers could stay to recover. It was popular amongst officers, but also she treated ordinary soldiers too. Her nickname was Mother Seacole, and although she wasn't a pioneer of nursing in perhaps the same way that Nightingale was, she was certainly someone who should be remembered and probably saved the lives of soldiers during the Crimean War. She was very much an instinctive carer, or instinctive nurse, if there is such a thing. Her history when saving Jamaicans from a cholera epidemic that killed over 30,000. Seacole had attributed the outbreak to infection brought in on a steamer from New Orleans, Louisiana, demonstrating knowledge of contagion theory well before that kind of knowledge was commonplace. And this was something that Nightingale never looked into, was the possibility of a contagion theory. That was something that came much later. Mary died aged 75, and it's probably only in the last 15 years or so that her name has become better known. Although some people believe it is incongruous, as it takes the attention away from Nightingale. Some of the Nightingale scholars, if you like, don't believe that Seacole was anything more than a waitress who used to bring people fresh drinks and give them clean sheets. I think Seacole was a nurse of a different type, but that's just my opinion. Nightingale was very much a facts and figures type person, very stiff, albeit caring and focused on nothing but her patient, whereas the description of Seacole was a lot more soft and trusting in care to help people. But where does this all fit into St Thomas's Hospital in London? Well, the original hospital dates back, they believe, as far as the 12th century, amazingly enough. The hospital was named after St Thomas Becket, the same Becket who was hacked to death by the Knights of King Henry II outside Canterbury Cathedral. Remember my early show on the Canterbury Witch Trials? Well, if you want more information on Becket and what happened to him, go along to one of the Canterbury Ghost Tours and ask John Hippersley about it. The original site in Southwark was run by a mixed order of Augustinian monks and nuns dedicated to St Thomas Becket, and provided shelter and treatment for the poor, sick and homeless. In the 15th century, Richard Whittington endowed a lying-in ward for unmarried mothers. Yes, this is the same Whittington who was actually the inspiration for Dick Whittington, the panto that a lot of children over the years have been to see. Anyway, when St Thomas's moved to Lambeth, the new premises were destined to be a lot more modern and even bigger than it had been prior. In 1860, due to donations made from a public fund for training nurses, the donations being in large part due to the work of Nightingale and her team in the Crimea, a nursing school was opened at St Thomas's called the Nightingale School. Those two sentences I read out at the beginning about bolsters and cleaning things and everything else came from the regulations attributing to nurses as the college in 1860. As one of Nightingale's sort of achievements was the introduction of trained nurses into the workhouse system in Britain from the 1860s onwards. This meant that sick paupers were no longer being cared for by other able-bodied paupers, but by properly trained nursing staff. In the first half of the 19th century, nurses were usually former servants or widows who found no other job and therefore were forced to earn their living by this work. Charles Dickens, obviously eponymous of that age, caricatured the standard of care in his 1842-1843 novel Martin Chuzzlewit in the figure of Sarah Gamp as being incompetent, negligent, alcoholic and corrupt. According to Caroline Worthington, the director of the Florence Nightingale Museum, which I can say from experience is a very interesting place that you can visit, based in St Thomas's Hospital itself. When she, Nightingale, started out, there was no such thing as nursing. The Dickens character Sarah Gamp, who was more interested in drinking gin than looking after her patients, was actually only a mild exaggeration. Hospitals were places of last resort, where the floors were laid with straw to soak up the blood. Florence transformed nursing when she got back from the Crimea. She had access to people in high places, and she used it to get things done. Florence was stubborn, opinionated and forthright, but she had to be those things to achieve what she did. The Nightingale School, interestingly enough, didn't have its first male nurse until 1972, over 100 years later. I find that quite interesting. Florence also played a vital role in the design and planning of hospitals, realising that buildings themselves could affect a person's health. But that wasn't all, and this is quite amazing. Florence is also credited with inventing the pie chart, and was the first woman to be elected by the Royal Statistical Society. She was also the first woman to be awarded the Freedom of the City of London, which she received in 1909. She died aged 90 in 1910. An amazing age to achieve, considering the level of sickness she was exposed to for probably a good 70-odd years of her life. And she did actually suffer with ongoing maladies herself once she returned from the Crimea. So there's your whistle-stop explanation of Florence Nightingale. I said it would be whistle-stop. And after the break, we are going to hear from Richard and talk all things paranormal. Don't go anywhere.
Hello, Harry Price here. Good evening. If there's nothing myself and everybody else enjoy here on the other side more is the sit back and relax and listen to Parasearch Radio with its paranormal news, views and reviews from across the UK and beyond. Make sure to find out more about them on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web, whatever they are, to keep up to date with all their broadcasts throughout the week. And I hope you enjoy them as much as we do over here. Hello? Is anybody there?
And welcome back to part 2 of this Haunted History show on St Thomas's Hospital. I am now joined by an Englishman who's across the pond, Mr Richard Estep. Hi Richard, how are you?
Good, Penny. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you ever so much for joining us once we worked out the time differences and when it was going to fit for both of us. The reason that Richard is our guest on the show today is he's written a fascinating book called The World's Most Haunted Hospitals, one of his many books that he's written. And one of the places he actually looked at was St Thomas's Hospital in London. But before we get to that, something I'm always interested in, because I know Richard has quite an interest. He has an interesting job as a paramedic, fire department paramedic. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. How did you get into the paranormal?
Well, that started when I was a kid. My grandparents lived in Hull, and they were one of those big post-Second World War families. Mm-hmm. My grandfather came back from Burma and had a whole bunch of kids, raised that big family.
Oh, crumbs, he worked on the railways out there. Was he on the railways in Burma?
No, he fought the Japanese.
Right, he wasn't imprisoned. He wasn't a POW or anything there?
No, absolutely not. He would have been lucky to come back at all had that been the case. But anyway, so he did his service in the war, came back, raised a family, and I'd heard stories growing up about the old lady that was supposed to haunt this house, and she was a very maternal, protective entity. Right. In fact, my aunts and uncles, none of them actually realized that she was a ghost. She would come into their room at night and would tuck them into bed and seemed to be a very watchful, protective spirit.
Right.
And interestingly enough, the house also had stories of poltergeist phenomena going on. My grandparents would hear the sounds of a party going on downstairs, would go downstairs, everything's quiet, but pictures have been taken off the walls, those kind of things. Yeah. And when their kids grew up and moved out, as kids tend to do, the activity stopped and the lady stopped appearing. Right. But having heard those stories, I would lie awake at night in the guest bedroom there and just terrified. On the one hand, I thought it would be so incredibly amazing to see her, and on the other, terrified that I actually might. Yeah. And I never did, but the stories just fascinated me. And when I got older, and you become an adult, you start to relate to the people you grew up looking up to as adults. I said, come on, were you telling me stories here? Were you just trying to frighten a kid? And they're like, no, this is legit. And they still tell this story to this day, consistently telling the same story. They all describe this older lady that would come into their room at night, took them into bed, and make sure that they were on the way to sleep.
Well, that's an amazing story, though. That's a really nice story to tell, because a lot of people who aren't into the paranormal think, automatically think spirits and stuff are evil or bad, or they want to do something negative. I don't know whether it's some of the television programs on paranormal investigating are to blame for that, but that's a really kind, warm, sort of caring story.
Well, and we did find out that the lady that owned the house before them had died in the house.
Right.
And so my experience has been, and again, this is purely theory, but generally two reasons a place is haunted, or at least intelligently haunted. On the one hand, you have trauma, great tragedy. You have battlefields, those kind of places where people suffered and suffered greatly and seemed to imbue it with some sort of psychic energy. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, you have the opposite. You have people that were very happy and content in a place, that loved it a great deal, and either part of them remains behind or they drop back in. I don't know what the actual mechanics of that would be. And I think we're dealing with the second sort in this case.
Well, that's one of the things I'm trying to explain. Places like Kelvin and Hatch nuclear bunker in Essex, nobody's ever died there, as far as we know. Nobody died there while it was being manufactured, unlike Drakelow tunnels in the West Midlands. Obviously, nobody was ever locked up in there for a nuclear war because, thank God we haven't had one. But why is it so haunted? And one of the theories is that the people who worked there, it was such an emotional event for them, they've drifted back to that thing that really meant something to them when they were living. So it's one of those, but we won't ever, I guess we'll never ever know for sure until we're possibly in that situation ourselves as to what, do you choose which time you want to go back to if you're going to, or is it just an automatic kind of, almost like a homing beacon? Who knows?
Yeah, my part-time job, I'm a tour guide. I do ghost tours at the Stanley Hotel.
Okay.
Which was I'm sure you've heard of it. It was the inspiration for The Shining.
Shining, yes.
Yeah,
talking about
and
scary films.
The fourth floor, which seems to be the most active, almost all of the phenomena there reported are childlike in nature, the apparitions of children, child's footsteps running up and down the halls. And our in-house historian did research. We have not one instance of a child dying in that hotel in the 108 years it's been open. So why would there be so much activity? And it turns out, when you research the building, that the fourth floor was where the nannies and children lived.
Right.
So it was one big common attic space rather than guest rooms back in the early 1900s. Right. And so you had those. We can all think back, and I can't speak for our international listeners here, but certainly for English listeners, we always remember those, long summers where you'd be out of school for months and you just got to play all day, you got to just have fun for weeks and weeks on end. And I don't know about you, but I look back on that with a lot of fondness. The kids that would have stayed at that hotel, same deal. Yeah. That would have been their equivalent of the long summers spent, just playing and playing with other kids. And I think, again, something of that has remained.
Yeah. Probably. Oh, now I've learned something else about you. The Stanley Hotel. Crikey. That is. I think anyone who's I've just got the vision of coming through the door saying, "Here's Johnny" right now. That's just exactly what I'm thinking of. It's an amazing. Shining is an amazing film and book, and I love the setting. I think the hotel's beautiful. Is it actually as beautiful up close as it looks on film?
So there's kind of a misconception there. Kubrick's version of The Shining was not shot at the Stanley.
Was it not?
It was shot. Nope, it was shot in England. It was shot entirely on sets because Kubrick, for one reason, was terrified of flying, so he would never have left the UK.
That one, yeah.
I mean, this is a guy that makes a Vietnam War movie and shoots it at a gasworks outside London.
But the external shots were.
So Stanley, the externals. Nope. The externals were actually, if you look, they are the Timberline Lodge in Mount Hood, Oregon.
Right.
And the reason is that Estes Park, where the Stanley is, so we don't have snow all year round, whereas Mount Hood, Oregon does.
Right.
So Kubrick basically said to the owners of that hotel, "Hey, can you be my exterior for the Overlook Hotel?" But when Stephen King bought the rights back from Kubrick to shoot his version of The Shining, which was a mini-series with Rebecca De Mornay.
Yes, yeah.
That's the one they shot at the Stanley, and they rented the whole hotel. So if you see the mini-series, that's pretty much all shot at our hotel.
Oh, okay. I learned something. That's fascinating. Okay. So it was the stories of how growing up and everything. That's how you kind of got into the paranormal. Mm-hmm. How long did it take you before you started maybe doing your own investigations or joining in with an investigation group? And was that in the UK or was that by the time you'd gone to America?
No, it was in the UK. Well, the first thing I used to do, because I was so fascinated, was I would go to the library, my hometown. I'm a Leicester lad, so shout out to Leicester if anyone's there. The Syston Library, and then the big lending library in Leicester. And I would read books by guys like Peter Underwood.
Yeah.
The classics, Elliot O'Donnell, the the great paranormal investigators, Harry Price's Borley Rectory stuff. So I used to devour those, and I would check those out sometimes 2-3 times a year and just go over them. There were no ghost hunting shows back then.
No.
Which some would consider a good thing. And that's a whole can of worms we shouldn't open up.
Yeah,
But
we'll
anyway,
leave that one firmly shut for now, because most people
Yeah.
know my view on some of the ghost shows that we get on television over here. Yeah. Yeah.
But in the mid-90s, I got a chance to join a local group in Leicester called Spectre. And they were run by a very colourful chap called Andrew Wright. And if you picture kind of Keith Richards, you're not far off Andrew's approach. He's still alive and well and enjoying retirement, by the way. But Andrew was kind of the only investigative team out there in the early to mid-90s. So I apprenticed with him. He kind of taught me his way of doing things. I learned a bunch from him. And I went to a church in Lincolnshire, St. Botolph's in Skidbrook.
Yeah.
Skidbrook Church, and had just an incredible couple of overnight investigations there. And that kind of got me into the investigation bug. That was in 1995, and I haven't stopped since.
Wow. Okay. Well, what made you start writing, though?
I'd read some books. Like I said, all my life I've had a library of paranormal books, some better than others. And I just wanted to... Firstly, I pitched a book about how to investigate my own methods. And the publisher kicked it back, Llewellyn. They said, quite honestly, how to investigate books are a dime a dozen. They're not selling, so thanks, but no thanks. And I'd learned that that's not an absolute, you're writing so horrible, you should cut your hands off, never talk to us again response from a publisher.
Yeah.
It was we like the way you write, just not what you wrote about. So I said, thanks very much. Out of curiosity, what is selling? And they said, people are wanting to read true life ghost accounts.
Yeah.
So I said, well, I've done this for 20-something years. What if I wrote up some of my favorite cases? And they said, pitch that book to us. Give us 3 chapters and an outline. So that's how I got writing.
Ah. So which was your first book?
It was called In Search of the Paranormal. That came out in 2015.
Right.
And that's half the cases are British cases, including the church I mentioned. Half the cases are stateside. And the sequel to that is contracted. I have to turn that in August the 1st, and that is going to be my book for next Halloween, next October.
Ah, nice one. Because the other one that I've sort of looked at a couple of, you got the Asylum 49 book, but you've also got one that talks about the 1864 Sand Creek massacre.
Oh, so that's the history of my adopted hometown here in the States, haunted Longmont.
Okay.
And Longmont has
What was the Sand Creek massacre?
It was a massacre of Native Americans by American cavalry forces, by U.S. cavalry forces.
Right.
It's not exactly the proudest day in American military history. A long story short, men, women, and children were butchered by American soldiers, which was quite common during the 1800s as the frontier was expanding. Yeah. And there are ties with that massacre to a murder that took place here in Longmont, or at least alleged ties. So I had a lot of fun reading into the history of that and picking that apart.
Wow, okay. And the Asylum 49?
Hands down my favorite haunted location in the world.
Okay.
So Asylum 49 is the name for a hospital called the Tooele Valley Hospital in Tooele, Utah.
Right.
And they closed this place down around 15 years ago because a newer hospital opened up, and they just walked out. They abandoned it.
Right.
So they left behind beds, X-ray machines. It's literally,
like
imagine
a ghost
that
town.
a ghost hospital. The staff just downed tools and walked out when they closed it. And so it stayed empty for a while. The rear half of the building was a retirement home for senior citizens. And then it came into private hands, so the hospital was purchased and turned into a haunted house.
Okay.
By which I mean the kind of place where on Halloween, I don't know if you get these as much in the UK, but you go to this place and there are zombies and ghouls and jump scares and stuff like that.
Yeah, we don't have those much in the UK. We're starting to get more of them, especially with things like programs like The Walking Dead being so popular, but it tends to be more sort of conventions and things like that.
Right.
We don't have the whole haunted house thing.
Well,
we don't sort of partake in Halloween as much as
I remember that
you guys do. So that's
too
not
bad.
changed.
It's my favorite holiday, I think, these days. Anyway, what's unique about Asylum 49 as a haunted house is it's full contact, which means that you sign a waiver before you go in, and the actors, the performers, will grab you and stuff you in a coffin. They'll kidnap you, put you on a gurney. I mean, it's really terrible.
Do you know what amazes me? And I've read about these places. Knowing what the Americans are like for litigation,
Yep.
I don't know how you guys get away with it.
Well, the key thing is the waiver, I think.
It must be
and
well written.
It's all filmed, so the security system in there is filming all the time. And you're right. You wouldn't think America would be willing to accept this, but people love being scared.
Yeah.
And in fact, when I investigate there at Halloween, I actually join in the fun. My investigators and we become zombies for the night.
Okay.
And we will do that. We will pick people out of the crowd. We'll drag them indoors, turn them over to the demonic surgeons. It's very, very fun.
Wasn't that an episode of Criminal Minds where it was actually a serial killer?
I couldn't tell you.
I'm sure there was an episode of Criminal Minds once where it was a serial killer who was masquerading in one of these kind of haunted houses. These people who were supposed to be getting scared were genuinely getting very scared, and they were getting killed.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
But anyway, long story short, that's when the old hospital itself is most paranormally active. And they've had more than a few accounts of customers, and I'll give you an example. The old emergency room, which is now drenched in fake blood, they had complaints, and people said, I really loved the experience, but you want to have a word with that guy in the emergency room, the doctor? Like, he's proper angry. Like, he looks at you like he really doesn't want to be here, like he's not acting, like you have no business being here. Now, of course, they didn't have somebody playing a doctor in the emergency room. Turns out that's the physician, the apparition of the doc that used to oversee that ER.
Right.
And so they have accounts of children that are seen in there that are messing around with visitors also. And this all tends to happen in the run-up to Halloween, September, October, November.
So as the energy's kind of building.
Yeah. So when I wrote World's Most Haunted Hospitals, there is a chapter on Asylum 49.
The first chapter. Yeah.
Right. And I drove to Utah from Colorado. We made a 500-mile one-way road trip to spend a night there.
Yeah.
And it was dead. It was quiet. Absolutely not impressed. But I went through the archive, talked to some witnesses who'd had incredible experiences, and they said, here's the problem. You're coming here in like April. We're off season. This place really is just abandoned. If you came back in October, we have tens of thousands of people coming through here, and they're all terrified out of their mind. That's when this place really crawls. So I said, it's a long way to come for a day or a weekend. I said, how about you let me move in for a week? And so they gave permission. They allowed us to go investigate for a week, and now it's become an annual tradition. I wrote The Haunting of Asylum 49 based upon my first couple of years investigating there. And, if you live in a location for a week or two, you really get to learn the ins and outs of it. And I think immersion adds a whole dimension to investigation.
You get to learn the building as well. You get to learn what's normal for the building, how the building feels, the sort of the noises that are normal for that building as well. So they're things you may never have heard before, but once you've lived somewhere, that creaking, that always happens at 6 o'clock in the morning because it's the building. Yeah. Maybe we'll have to talk about this one after Halloween this year then. How does that sound?
Good.
Yeah?
Absolutely.
Cool. But the other thing about your writing that's unusual is you don't just do the non-fiction reference type books. You write fiction as well.
I do. I like ghost stories. I think a lot of people enjoy a good ghost story, so I like writing them.
Okay.
I tend to do more non-fiction than fiction these days, purely because the non-fiction stuff is self-published and
right.
It's not contracted. A contracted book has to take precedence because then you get deadlines.
Yeah.
So I tend to do about twice as much non-fiction, generally speaking.
How do you find time to do all this, Richard?
It's 1,000 words a day, come rain or shine.
Okay.
Is really the secret. It's like you ask someone that runs marathons, which most definitely isn't me. How do you find the time to train for this? And they'll tell you, I just get out and do it every day.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
I mean, that's really the answer. There's no shortcuts, and it's not easy when my friends are out drinking or doing whatever. I'm at home at a keyboard. It's not always fun.
And now you've got the Haunted magazine column as well.
That's right. Yeah, first one was about Asylum 49. Again, it's fun to write and be able to tell these stories, and I just have to remind myself I grew up reading this kind of stuff, and I loved it, and now I'm lucky enough to be able to do it myself.
I must admit, that's one of the things about doing this show. I absolutely love it. It appeals to two things that I adore, history and the paranormal. And I get to do it every week, and I have an excuse to sit down and research things and, say, drag the kids to museums and sort of places that I want to investigate if I can. Yeah, you do. Yeah, I do get what you're saying, but I love writing. I just don't get a chance to do it as much as I would like. We're looking after two young kids, working full time, and everything else. But I do like the way your books are written. I do like, especially, I mean, the one I've sort of read from cover to cover, the Haunted Hospitals one. They're written in a very intelligent but easy to understand way. They're not patronising. Some of these sort of books I've read have been quite almost patronising and condescending to the reader. It doesn't read like that. It reads as informative, and it's got a balance. It's not just the ghost stories. It's kind of, each chapter's almost like one of my radio shows, actually, Richard. You might recognise one at some point.
You never know.
You never know.
I think one thing that, and it informs my writing, I guess, but one thing I hope comes across in all the books is I'm always looking for a skeptical explanation, but not an uber-skeptical explanation. And I think, having learned one thing more than anything else in this field over the years, the more certain somebody is about the field, the less I tend to trust their opinion.
Yes.
You know, and it's amazing to me. I've had people that I've interviewed that tell you, absolutely, this is a demonic case because children are always demons and when they manifest, and all this kind of stuff.
They've watched too many Ghost Adventures.
Right. But the more certain people are, this is a field that we are built on uncertainty, and I think there are no experts. No. There are just those that have done it a lot, and we all develop our own biases and our own opinions. And I think the truly wise ones learn to say, maybe this is a natural, there is a natural cause for this. Maybe there isn't. I'm not sure, but here's where I'm leaning.
The one I get, I mean, I don't know what your thoughts about this is the orbs question. Right. Yeah. Okay. Let me finish. I put on we like to make discussions on the Parasearch page, and somebody had put on their orbs, real or not. And I'd put, I think 99.9% of them are either light flashes, there's something on the lens, it's an insect. But I said you can't categorically say every single orb that is ever captured on film, be it video film or camera, digital, can't think what the old type of cameras were called, but you know, not the old style before digital came in. You can't say that every single thing is something that could be argued away. And this chap got very angry with me and was basically calling me stupid and all of this, saying the research is there to say they don't exist. And I read the research, he sent it to me, and I said to him, well, first you've sent me two lots of research. It's actually the same research, just worded slightly differently. And I said, secondly, it doesn't prove to me that every single one, you know, it doesn't recreate every single case. And he just turned around and said, oh, you'd believe the world was flat then, wouldn't you? And I said, yes, but scientifically they did believe the world was flat until someone proved unequivocally that it wasn't. This does not prove to me unequivocally that it isn't. That these kind of things, I genuinely think 99.9% of orbs would be corrected by a good vacuum with a Dyson, but I don't think every single one is it's the same as when you hear noises in a house. 99% of them could probably be the heating system, the floorboards creaking, the temperature changing because the temperature's changing outside, but you can't say every single one has got an explanation. And that's where I got he was getting quite abusive towards me about it, and I just cut him out of the conversation. But I think there's a lot of people that want it to be something supernatural.
Yes,
or paranormal.
It comes back to certainty, Penny. You hit the nail on the head. And I also, by the way, this is something we see when you talk about the whole possibility of ghosts in general. Not just orbs as a subset, but the existence of ghosts, period. People will tell you it's been proven that this is not science. This absolutely categorically does not happen. There's no evidence for it. And the one thing you hit on is this: 99.9% has a rational, i.e. dust or insect, explanation. But if just one case, just one, is so anomalous, out of however many,
Mm-hmm.
And this is true with ghost stories too. 99% of them, but look back to the first ghost stories which come to us, I think, from the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
You've got literally millions of witnesses over the years. If just one of those stories is genuine and cannot be explained, you have to conclude that there's something more to this.
I mean, my dad, he's a scientist. He's a real sort of like, if I can't see it or touch it, it doesn't exist. And as he's got older and as I've got older, and we've got sort of family traumas and stuff, even he is starting to accept the possibility that there might be something out there that he can't understand, which for him is quite a hard thing to do. And it came down to an experience. It started really as an experience I had. It was I it's not something I mind talking about. I lost my sister about 21 years ago, and she was only 19, and it was very unexpected, very sudden. But about a year before that, I'd been at the funeral of my old history teacher, who was the chap who gave me my love of history, if I'm completely honest. He really encouraged me to enjoy history and to ask questions and to read stuff. And he died unexpectedly. He was playing rugby, I think. He was only in his 40s. And I went to his memorial service because I adored him I really liked him as a person. And my handbag had my keys in, and my bag was in you can imagine the English church, cold stone church. Nothing hot in it, no pipes or anything. It was middle of summer. My bag's on the front near my feet. Nobody's touched it. Nobody's leant on it. And I've driven to the church. When I come back to get back into my car key, and you know how thick a car key is, has been twisted around 180 degrees and bent over double. Now, I don't know how that happened. I ended up having to phone my sister, who still lived at home at this point, which was quite near where the church was, my parents' house. She had to rush me into Norwich to try and get another car key cut, because 2 days beforehand my then boyfriend had broken the other car key. And the locksmith, he was like, how did you do this? This is I can't even straighten this. And he had to actually snap it and try and cut it from the 2 snap pieces. My dad was like, logical explanation for it, and he tried to do it using pliers, using I can't think what those clamps are called that sit on the edge of a workbench. Do you know the thing?
Oh, I know what you mean. Yeah, I do know
those.
what you mean.
He used all these. He couldn't do it, and he had to admit it was paranormal because it wasn't normal. Now, why that happened? Could it have been my old history teacher not wanting me to get into a car because something was going to happen? Could it have been him knowing that my sister was going to pass away 12 months later, and he wanted us to have a fun thing, almost a story to sort of talk about, because it did cause much amusement. Her and I were killing ourselves laughing as she's flying off in her little mini metro into the centre of Norwich for me to get this new key cut. I don't know, but it was.
Oh, I think it's obvious what happened.
Go on.
It was some swamp gas reflecting off Venus, and then it's the whole Men in Black joke, isn't it? That you have to take the so-called rational explanation and you have to twist it and jump through so many hoops in order to make it quote-unquote non-paranormal that, you kind of defy all logic. And that's my criteria. You reach a point, don't you, with any good investigation where if you're going to be objective, the facts just don't lend themselves to a non-paranormal explanation.
Yeah.
And it sounds to me like that's what you have. I can't think of any way that could have happened.
No. Let's say my dad, the mechanical engineer, the scientist, very intelligent man, he spent days with old car keys trying to replicate it. Couldn't do it. I even went into the church and checked the pews to check there wasn't pipes underneath it could have been touching. Nothing. It was like June, July time. They didn't have any heating on. The church was cool, as stone churches tend to be. There is no, and I'd driven to the church half an hour beforehand. There was no, and no one had touched my bag. It had been by my feet the whole time. I didn't kneel on it because I'm actually not religious, so I don't do the kneeling bits. I'm sitting there more to pay respect to my old teacher than the other bit. There was no explanation, and it was that event, and my dad did actually start to go, maybe there is something in it. But as you say, he investigated to try and replicate, and he couldn't replicate it. And even, let's say, the locksmith said, how the hell did you do this?
I really have a great deal of respect for that mindset, for someone who's scientific but is willing to say, all right, let's put it to the test.
Yeah.
Which plainly happened, and then the integrity to say, I got nothing.
Yeah.
I have no explanation. And again, with the with the absolutists who say this stuff just cannot happen, you've only got to be wrong once.
Yep.
You know, and that's anyway. It's an interesting way to look at the world, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm a skeptic, but I'm still a believer. I believe it's possible, but I am going to try and rule everything else out. But sometimes the experiences you can't rule them out. There is just no logical explanation for some things that have happened. But
skepticism's a word that we've abused, and I think it's the Agent Scully syndrome is where it tends to originate. See how many alien invasions, but still deny the fact that the truth of it is, real skepticism is saying, all right, where does the evidence point?
Yeah.
And ultimately, if you run out of quote-unquote rational explanations, then even the skeptic has to conclude that there's something inexplicable. And you don't necessarily have to believe it's the spirits of the dead or that it's discarnate entities, but just being willing to say, I don't know,
It was
is
interesting.
a huge leap.
Yeah, I was watching an interview, online interview with one of the Ghost Asylum guys, and they're very religious, very, very religious. And each their own. I have no problems with that. But one of the questions that one of them Porter actually got asked was, how do you marry up being a paranormal investigator with being what do they call it, missionary Baptist or whatever the religion is? So quite. And he said, well, why does everyone think that paranormal is bad? All paranormal means is it can't be explained by normal reasoning. That doesn't mean it's the devil. That doesn't mean it's going against the Bible. He said it's just not normal. It can't be explained. And he said, and how many religious experiences could be coined as being paranormal? Yet that's okay. And I thought that was quite a good way of looking at it.
But we live in an age now, don't we, where and I'm not religious either, but even the Vatican, if I recall correctly, has said it's okay to investigate this kind of stuff. I know that there was some "thou shalt not comport with spirits" kind of ruling earlier, and there was a point not so long ago when the Vatican said that this kind of research is okay. And I'd read in an article that the Vatican itself has been conducting some EVP research.
Possibly. Well, isn't it meant to be the Vatican that you're meant to go to if you want an exorcism? But then again, they also seem to promote everything it needs an exorcism. It's a demonic possession, wherein it could just be someone's got some kind of illness that almost.
My understanding
is in tongues.
It's quite hard to get an exorcism. I understand that there's a lot of red tape and things that have to be proven to the church's satisfaction. So I'm not an expert, but I do have a friend who is a Catholic priest and is also a paranormal investigator. And as a 20-year skeptic, 22-year now skeptic, I had never brought anything home with me after a case.
Yeah.
And then a couple of years ago, it happened. It happened at Christmas.
Right.
We had some very odd things going on, to the point where me, Mr. Skeptic, I called him and said, Steve, you're going to think I'm crazy, but will you come bless or exercise my house or do whatever you do?
Yeah.
So he actually did. Came over. This was me crying uncle and saying, the stuff in this that's going on in my own home is weird enough. I really need to get rid of it. And we were talking, and I said, Stephen, I'm not religious as you are. I said, isn't it kind of hypocritical for me to ask you to come in here and do this? And he said, it's not about the specific belief system. It's about the belief itself. It's about intent. It's not about, are you a Christian or are you, do you have some other belief system? It's about intent. And I will tell you that after his ceremony, the house quieted down and we stopped seeing the phenomena we were seeing. So
yeah, who knows?
Who
but
knows?
On to St Thomas's. Obviously, St Thomas's has got an interesting background. The whole of London's got an interesting background, to be quite honest. The fact it was named after Sir Thomas Becket, who was quite brutally slain in Canterbury in the 1100s, all that kind of thing. And one of the interesting things was that, I did mention it in my first half. Florence Nightingale was very much linked to St Thomas's. That's where she started her original school of nursing. Obviously, because of your connection to the medical profession, you probably have got sort of lines into somewhere like that us mere mortals wouldn't have. What sort of research did you do, and who did you talk to when you were doing your chapter on St Thomas's?
Sure. Well, generally speaking, just as a quick intro, when I was writing World's Most Haunted Hospitals, I did want to talk to doctors, nurses, medics, people that are in the profession.
Mm-hmm.
And you're looking at people that are very scientifically trained.
Yeah.
A medical degree, there's a great deal of critical thinking, a great deal of science. You have to have classes in biology, chemistry, organic chemistry, you name it. So these are not generally fanciful people.
Yeah. They tend to be quite calm people as well, under pressure.
And good observers and trained observers as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it was amazing to me that a lot of them had paranormal experiences to recount. And even those that didn't believe in it, I had this conversation a lot of times, right?
Yeah.
Oh, ghosts and stuff like that. I don't believe in all of that garbage. However, this one time, and then they go on and tell me a great ghost story.
Yeah.
So with St. Thomas's, a friend of mine is an oncologist, and she was serving at St. Thomas's, and she encountered the Grey Lady herself. And this is again
that
a
Dr.
complete...
Leary? Is that Dr. Leary
Yeah.
you mentioned in the book? Okay.
Yeah, Alison is. We were just talking about it in passing, and she's very open-minded, I would say, but she said, "Oh yeah, I had this experience. I encountered her myself," and that kind of got me interested because I had a personal attachment there. Alison was a friend. And I said, "You've got to tell me this story." And apparently this has been handed down from generation to generation of staff at that particular hospital for the past century or so. This Grey Lady that is seen walking the hallways, or sometimes gliding through the hallways of St. Thomas's, and the sheer number of witnesses that have reported her over the years is into the hundreds.
Mm.
And again, you're talking surgeons, everyone from surgeons to cleaners to janitors.
So does she have the reputation like some sort of supposed spirits in places like the hospitals, care homes? If she appears to you, your days are numbered? Or is she cared for people? Or...
Oh, the whole harbinger of death thing?
Yeah.
That's a great archetype, isn't it?
Yeah. There's one I read of about a care home that this phantom cat appears, and if it sits on your bed, you die that night.
I've heard that. I've heard of archetypes like that also.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've also heard, and there was another London hospital, University College, which I also wrote about in Haunted Hospitals, where they have a nurse whose ghost is seen. Her name was Lizzie, and she had accidentally overdosed a patient on morphine, which gives somebody too much morphine, they stop breathing, they die.
Right.
And the sad truth of that was that this was her fiancé.
Oh.
Which should never happen. Medically, there's an ethical issue with caring for someone that is related to you. But anyway, she appears mostly when pain medications are being administered, and she seems to be a very cautionary apparition, one that's saying, make sure you don't give too much.
So
this can end in
tears. To learn from her mistake.
Be careful. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Almost like some kind of penance.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting to me. The Grey Lady, on the other hand, I haven't heard of anything about she appears and people tend to die. I haven't heard of that personally, but I know that is attached to her legend.
Right.
So whether that's, I don't think anybody has ever said the Grey Lady appeared in this area and then a patient died. I think it's just something a tale that grows with the telling.
Mm.
And there is a lot of rumor and kind of folklore attached to any story like this, especially in hospitals, where people do love to tell stories after dark. And of course, it doesn't take long for it to take on its own life.
Yes. But your friend Alison, when she saw her, was she scared of her at all? Or was it more of a just, oh, who's this?
No, Alison actually didn't realize that what she'd encountered at the time was a ghost. It was an after-the-fact thing, which, if you talk to people that see apparitions, you hear that quite often.
Mm.
I didn't realize at the time. I just thought it was another person.
Yeah.
So Alison, said that she seemed very real. She didn't look ghostly, and she was very tired at the time. So you do have to factor in,
sleep
just like pretty much any doctor. Certainly in the UK, who works so many hours, you have to factor that in.
Yeah.
But she just thought she was real. She was moving with a purpose, not just wandering around. But remembered afterwards that she didn't hear any footsteps on a tile floor.
Ooh.
And what's interesting is that a lot of the residual apparitions, the ones that don't seem intelligent, they don't interact with the living in any way. They often don't make eye contact any more than the characters on your TV screen do.
Yeah.
Well, the Grey Lady did look at Alison as she passed by, did make eye contact, and she noticed that the air seemed kind of unusually cold, which is what made her do the double take afterwards as the Grey Lady passed, which fits with what other eyewitnesses have said.
Yeah. So do we have any idea who this Grey Lady could be?
So again, theories out the wazoo as to who she is, and the most common one is that it's Florence Nightingale, but there are also tales that it's a nurse who committed suicide in the hospital.
Right.
One that said she fell down a lift shaft, another that she was murdered. I mean, honestly, there is no way to tell.
No.
I know that Florence Nightingale is the most famous nurse associated with St. Thomas's, and I think that's why the story has become so prevalent. You know, it would be a nice thing, wouldn't it, indeed? It makes for a better tale. But in reality, you're looking at thousands of nurses that would have worn that uniform and performed service in the hospital, so who knows?
Wow. Yeah, I gut feeling, I think, I agree with you, saying it's Florence is a bit too of an easy get out. But most nurses are quite caring, so the fact that this one is sort of seen to be caring and tending to people and everything else is a good nurse. So it's an interesting one. Well, thank you ever so much for your time, Richard. We've been talking for quite a while now because, it's an interesting conversation to be having all about this sort of thing. And maybe we'll talk again sort of November time about Asylum 49, or how's it pronounced again? Tuella?
And well done.
Thank you.
Well done for not doing what most American interviewers do, and they pronounce it as Tool.
Yeah, well, that's what they're being by calling it that, I think. Yes, so hopefully we'll get to talk about that. What have you got coming up? That you say you've got your second book, the follow-up to In Search of the Paranormal's out October?
No, that's next year. This year, my book about the cage, the witch's prison in St. Osyth, is due
just
out
up the road
in
from
October.
us in Essex. Well, I'm Chelmsford in Essex. The station's based at Witham in Essex, so it is just up the road from us. So you'll have to let us copy us in on the advert for it, and we'll share it on the Parasearch pages.
You bet,
for you,
absolutely.
If that's okay.
I'm writing 3 projects right now. I have a book about as you said, a sequel to In Search of the Paranormal. I'm writing also the haunted history of 30 East Drive in Pontefract.
Oh, okay.
And the third book is about Fox Hollow Farm, which was an American location, the home of a serial killer who killed 17 men in his swimming pool. And that property is now very haunted.
Yeah, was it Ghost Adventures did a show on that one not so long ago?
They did.
It's quite interesting, the history side and the sort of background
Yeah.
to it. Oh, that'll be an interesting one. Oh, I'll have to read all of them, Richard. I'll be downloading them all, I think.
Terrific.
I like to read, so. But it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you. Thank you ever so much. If anyone has got anything they want to ask Richard or whatever, please feel free to send her the messages through our Parasearch page, and we can forward them on to him. He's also got his own website you can contact him on. But all that leaves me to say is don't forget to listen to all the other shows on Parasearch Radio. If there is anything you want to listen back to on this show, you can listen to it on podcast or download. But I think it leaves me to say is have a good evening, sleep tight, and don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.